Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. All right, folks. So welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. And I'm very honored to have as my guest today, Dr. Ellen Bialystok. So thank you so much, Dr. Ellen.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's such a pleasure, as I mentioned, because I think everyone wants to know more about the topic you study, myself included. It's something that I think people are more concerned with. But before we get into that, I really wanted to ask you about science, if that's okay, because you are a scientist. I think nowadays a lot of people are worried that science is dictating what they have to do as teachers, as teacher trainers. But I want you to let the audience know, what is the importance of science, Ellen? Why is science, why does science matter at all?
Well, I could do an hour just on that topic. It's a
Yes.
crucial question, especially in these times,
Yes.
where in some countries, not mine, not yours, but in some countries, the climate for scientists has become very difficult. So why does science matter? I'm going to go further and say, why does basic discovery science that isn't conducted in pursuit of a particular cure for cancer or application or, creation of a new widget, why does that matter? And the reason is because knowledge underlies everything. And if we don't constantly expand our knowledge of the world, which is the job of scientists, we're nowhere. And I can give you an example. There's two examples that I think are very striking. One is very relevant to today. So 30 years ago, in this laboratory, someplace in the University of California, a young scientist, Jennifer Doudna, became interested in RNA. And she was considered to be a freak because everybody was interested in DNA.
Yeah.
DNA was sexy. DNA was the code for life. So scientists at the top of their game were looking at DNA. But for whatever reason, she was interested in RNA. She had no application. She had no, she wasn't going to cure anything. She was just interested in how this works. Well, fast forward, and without her work, we would not have mRNA vaccines. We would not have CRISPR gene editing. We would not have this thing that saved millions of people from dying of COVID.
Yeah.
It's all because of her basic research. She didn't know where it was going to go. That's where it ended up going. You got to support good basic research. The other example is Geoffrey Hinton, considered to be the godfather of AI. So 50 years ago, 40 years ago, he was interested in this hypothetical thing called neural networks.
Yeah.
Computers where, there were connections and algorithms. He just thought it was cool. Well, needless to say, there isn't anything we do now that doesn't have AI incorporated.
Yeah.
So you do discovery science because you need to expand knowledge. And you do it even if, and maybe especially if, you don't know where it's going to lead.
Yeah, that's fascinating and exciting. I think, I share this love for science, as most people who are watching us or listening to us probably do as well. But let's focus on your science more particularly. So what is the type of science that you do? What is the branch of science that you work with?
So I've always, I mean, always been interested in the question of how language and thoughts connect in the mind. And when I was a kid, I couldn't articulate it that way, but it was something that fascinated me. I remember thinking, if I couldn't speak English, it was very monolingual world here. If I
Yes.
couldn't speak English, would I be able to think? I mean, this is the
Ah,
thoughts of an 8 year old, a 9 year old, right?
yeah.
But that kind of question always fascinated me. And so I think I can trace all of the work I've done over the past 50 years in some way to that question. How does our mind combine the structures of language with the forms of thought that we create and then communicate? That's what I was interested in. Now, the bilingualism piece came later and by accident, and not something I was looking for.
Yeah.
But it's that central question about how minds connect languages and thoughts, and what does that tell us about
Yeah.
minds?
So at a very early age, you were hitting at Sapir Whorf, right? You were
Yeah,
thinking.
of course I was.
That's great.
And I
Yes.
come from a land of snow. So
Yeah.
everybody would debate how many kinds of snow there were. It was very normal, right?
Exactly. And that's such an interesting topic. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but then that led you into the realm of bilingualism and how bilingualism relates to cognition, right, Ellen? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So I guess there's two pieces. One is how did I stumble into this? And I'm not going to go there. I mean, the series of steps that took me. I was trained as a developmental psychologist. I was interested in language and thought. My PhD investigated the relation between the words children were learning and the thoughts they were developing, that kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
that's pretty clear. There were a couple of accidental life circumstances that led me to bilingualism. So that's not the interesting story. But once I was there, and I started, this would have been 1976. My PhD is 1976. There was really, like, bilingualism was not really a thing.
Yeah.
And most of the research was from language teachers like yourself,
Yeah.
and the vast majority of that body of work was from British language teachers who were sent by the British Council
Yeah.
to teach English throughout the Commonwealth. This was a huge thing. It was very well funded, and they would pick all of these smart young guys out of the best schools and pack them off to the Commonwealth, India, and wherever, right? And they were sent without training pretty well, but they were smart people. So they'd start teaching English, and in many cases, reflect on what their experiences were revealing about this process of, in many cases, adults learning a second language. Those insights formed I'm going to say, entire body of work that I encountered when I first moved from just child language and thought into second language acquisition and bilingualism.
Yeah.
So it was the insights of teachers and their actual experiences, noticing all kinds of things. I mean, linguistic insights, cognitive insights, sociolinguistic. It was very broad. And again, smart people uh, dabbling in rich experiences, not to solve problems, but just to discover, will find interesting things. So that was the literature I encountered. Now, in terms of bilingual children, which remained an interest, these were interesting times. So, again, this is 1976. There was research in the first 50 years and a little more of the 20th century that said bilingualism makes children stupid.
Yeah.
They become retarded and confused, and they will go out and become mass murderers. And
Yeah.
you want to be really
It
careful of
delays
that.
speech development and things like that, right? Interferes with cognitive development. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and this was based on studies in which standardized IQ tests were given to
Mm.
children. Now, again, I could go on for an hour about this. First of all,
Yeah.
you don't standardize IQ tests to children. Just don't do that. But you
Yeah.
especially don't do it without making sure that they have some proficiency in the language of the test, and on and on and on. So none of that happened. There was this conclusion, and the world learned that bilingualism is a terrible thing that makes children stupid.
Yeah.
Now, the counterpoint was a study from Montreal in 1962, Peel and Lambert study.
Yeah.
They also gave IQ tests to monolingual and bilingual children, but in their study, the bilingual children did better than the monolingual children. So now you have the table is set for figuring out what's going on. And that's kind of where I came in. Now, the other little piece, since this in the early 70s, there was a body of research that, as far as I know, and it isn't really going on much today, comparing monolingual and bilingual children for their ability to solve metalinguistic problems,
Oh,
metalinguistic awareness
yeah.
in monolingual and bilingual children. And this was a reasonable body of research with interesting results. And by and large, not every time, but in many studies, bilingual children were doing better. So now you have the backdrop. You have bilingualism makes children stupid. Peel and Lambert that said, actually, they're better. They have higher IQ scores. The metalinguistic stuff that shows it's a bit more complicated because metalinguistic tasks are psychological. They're
Yeah.
processing tasks. They're not IQ tests. And against what we learned from people teaching English to other people and figuring out some of the complexities, now we can actually begin to unravel what's really going on and whether the experience of bilingualism, in fact, has any effect on language and thought, on minds.
Yeah, that's incredible. And well, I want to ask you a little bit about it seems to me, it feels anyway here in Brazil that when I talk to parents and grown-ups and school managers even, that they still believe that bilingualism is bad for children. You're going to confuse children. And if you have, I don't know, maybe one of the parents is a foreigner and they are not encouraged to use their native language in the household because apparently it's going to do some harm. Or do you think it's connected to the
Oh,
early
that's absolute.
studies?
That's the
Yeah.
legacy.
Yeah.
But that's exactly right. That's the legacy. So
Yeah.
that stuff that came out in the first half of the 20th century permeated the sort of general public knowledge, which is based on what catchphrases and slogans, right?
Yeah.
This is, for example, when I was a kid, we were told after you eat, you should not go swimming for 2 hours.
Yes, I remember that.
And I,
Yeah.
I remember being, a kid on a beach at a picnic, and I want to jump into the lake, and my parents say, no, 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 you have to. That
Yeah.
now has been absolutely debunked. No
Yes.
child ever died from swimming after eating. Okay. So, I mean, once something gets out into the public as a slogan, it's pretty hard to pull it back.
Yes, most definitely. But so there was a turning point, and then a lot of papers came out showing that there might be something to bilingualism that actually enhances or improves cognition, right? So, and I think we can talk a little bit about that paper of yours that came out in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. That I think it was one of the pioneering papers at the time, because you had established the connection between bilingualism and improved executive functions, right? So can you tell us a little bit about that paper and explain what executive functions are?
So that paper came from a collaboration. I've been working with children, bilingual children, giving them various cognitive and metalinguistic and literacy tests for many years. And I was building up a reasonable body of evidence that on the whole, not entirely, bilingual children were solving many of these problems in a more precocious way than monolingual children. But these were silly little children problems. I mean, you made up silly stories and you asked them what the puppet said, or you showed them, moving toys, and they're children's tasks. And obviously, by the time these kids were 6 months or a year older, they were all going to solve these problems, right?
Yeah.
So we were picking up this little window where it was coming on board significantly earlier, but we're not talking about years, we're talking about 6 months or 12 months for bilingual children. So you can say, well, that's really nice, but if it's all washed away within 6 months or a year, does it really matter? What would be important would be to find some way of looking at the same questions in adults. But the whole thing had to be recast. We weren't going to give adults our children's tasks. We weren't going to give them the same kinds of questions and materials we've been using with children. So I was fortunate to get a leave at that time. I got this grant that gave me time off, and I could kind of recast everything I was thinking in collaboration with some new colleagues to see how we would test this in adults. All right.
Yeah.
And that 2004 study was the first of that new paradigm. So in sort of scraping around, it was suggested to me that in adult perception literature, there is this task that has a very solid empirical basis where people have to override the conflict from a preeminent, a kind of more automatic response, and instead replace it with a more considered response. So that's the Simon task, and it fits into a much more general umbrella of things called the executive function. So the executive function is a very poorly defined grab bag of processes. They exist. They're all controlled by structures in the prefrontal cortex. They all demand limited resource attention and performance. So they're all expensive in the sense of brain power.
Yeah.
So it was suggested to me that this would be a good place to start. So that's what we did in that first study. Now, in that first study, and here's the thing about that study is it's been cited many, many times, but I don't think people really read it. Because what people don't notice is that the participant groups were middle-aged adults and older adults. There were no young adults in this. Whereas, almost all of psychological research and executive functioning research is based on young adults. We didn't have any young adults. So we had middle-aged adults and older adults. We had very large advantages for the bilinguals in the older adult group, more muted advantages in the middle-age group, but we did not have younger adults. In the next few years, we repeated these studies with younger adults, and there were no differences. So for young adults, it doesn't matter if you're monolingual or bilingual, these are just easy tasks.
Yeah.
And so I wish that I had made a bigger point at the time of making clear we had not yet tested young adults. The first paper with young adults came out the next year, and we said there's no difference. It's an easier task. But that put everybody on this sort of train to look at executive functioning. And I bought into that fully, 100% into executive functioning. And I used to say things like bilinguals have better executive function than monolinguals. But that turns out not to be true. I was wrong. That
Yeah.
isn't what the difference was.
Well, that's how science moves, basically, right? So
Yeah,
you find
right.
new
We
evidence,
gave them
and
these tasks.
yeah,
We gave them a
yeah,
Simon task. The Simon task is an executive function task.
yeah,
Bilinguals did better. I guess bilinguals have better executive function. Not necessarily, because
yeah,
there's a lot going on there in the spaces between the boxes. So, it took really another 15 at least years of
yeah,
research to figure it out and realize that the executive function story does not explain the
yeah,
data. There are differences between monolinguals and bilinguals, but it's not because bilinguals just have better prefrontal cortex function. It's something else.
yes,
The other thing that became clear is that
yeah,
it was pretty easy to find differences between language groups. If you're looking at older adults or children, it was extremely difficult if you're looking at younger adults. So that too had to be accounted for.
yeah, and before we get into what you've recently found out, let's say, I want to talk a little bit more about that conclusion because I think as someone who works with bilingual curricula in Brazil, I remember that the pitch normally when they're trying to sell the curriculum to a school, they say that this is going to help your kids' inhibitory control or something like that. So normally, I remember hearing that many times. I might have said it a couple of times as well, because people want to sell the idea that bilingual kids are better able to control their behavior, to inhibit their thoughts and attitudes, and I think that was probably the legacy of that paper, right,
I
Ellen?
agree.
Yeah,
I said that, and that's what made sense at the time.
yeah,
But after a certain point, it no longer made sense. I think the first paper I wrote saying it's not inhibition was in 2015. And since then, I have tried to back off the inhibition executive function interpretation without backing off on the data. I mean, there are those who say, therefore, all the data are wrong. There is no bilingual advantage. This is something you hear. There is
yeah,
no bilingual advantage. And that's because people give, simple tasks to young adults and monolinguals and bilinguals perform the same. I know they do. Um,
yeah.
that's the research is harder than that.
Exactly. And let me ask you before we get into the more recent papers, because there's also the idea of being domain specific. So I remember talking to some psychologists when I was a student at the University of Bristol. We talked a lot about executive function training or something like that, and how those things are not necessarily transferable. That
Yeah.
if you practice, if you are bilingual, and let's say you can better control your inhibition, it doesn't mean that that's going to apply in every domain of your life, that automatically, right? So can you talk to about that a little bit? So there are certain things that don't transfer quite well, right? If I practice in this domain, it doesn't mean that other domain is going to get better, right?
So that's exactly the point. That is right. And
Yeah.
that was the dead end that the executive function story smashed up against. And again, I acknowledge, I used to say this. I'd say, well, these tasks where bilinguals do better, like the Simon task, like the Stroop task, like all these things, all require inhibition. You have to not pay attention to the position of the stimulus. You have to not pay attention to the name of the word. You have to, whatever it is, all of these tasks had some feature or information that would lead you to the wrong answer. So you had to, don't think about the pink elephant. That's the sort
Yeah.
of structure of executive function tasks. And so I said, and so here's another line that I think we should bring into the discussion. I've always worked in the cognitive side, but a very important group of researchers in parallel have worked on the language side. And what became incredibly clear with fantastic evidence, this is such good research, and this was sort of from starting in the mid-80s and continues, that in the bilingual mind, both languages are always active, there is no switch, which is incredible when you think about it, because it would have been a lot simpler to make a switch, right?
Yeah.
There is no switch. And yet the research showing that, I compared that finding, which has been replicated, and I've never done that research, but that body of research showing joint activation, I compared to a law of physics. Psychologists are always so insecure about, their crummy little ideas, whereas physics work in the real world and things are true. And this is true in the sense that laws of physics are true. So if you take this idea that in the bilingual mind, both languages are always active, why aren't you speaking Portuguese to me half the time?
Exactly.
You're not, right?
Exactly.
You're
So
not.
I must be inhibiting Portuguese somehow, or yes, yeah.
Oh, something is happening. So
Yeah.
I thought, aha, inhibition.
Yeah.
So here's what I thought was the brilliant story, which is wrong.
Yeah.
In a bilingual mind from a very early age, bilingual children, from the time they can speak, are constantly inhibiting the language they're not using. And that makes inhibition strong and available for all other purposes. So it transfers, so they do better on a Simon task. Except it's not, all right?
Yeah.
Because it's what you say, these things don't transfer. Transfer is a very specific process where problems that have strongly overlapping demands you can to some extent transfer, but even then, it's pretty tough to transfer. If you're a tennis player, can you transfer your skills to, I don't know, pickleball? To some extent.
Yeah.
Some of it will apply. Can you transfer your skills to football?
Yeah.
Unlikely.
Not many. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Maybe just
So,
running. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. In both tennis and football, there's a lot of running.
Yes.
You need to have aerobic fitness.
Yes.
Aerobic fitness is not a skill that transfers. It's an underlying resource.
Uh-huh.
And if you have a lot of aerobic fitness, you are better prepared both to play tennis and to play football.
Exactly.
Not because they're similar or transferable, but because they're both sitting on a common underlying resource.
Yeah.
That's what I think is going on with bilingualism.
And that's what you discussed in last year's paper, right? So you talked about how the underlying resource, the fitness, analogy here would be attention, right?
Exactly.
So can you
Exactly.
explain to us why attention? How did you come across that idea, and how did you experiment? How did you test?
Yeah. So attention is the most generic resource in cognitive psychology. It underlies everything. Memory and attention is a field because if you're not paying attention, you won't remember anything. I never remember people's names, and it's not because I'm stupid, it's because I don't pay attention when I'm introduced. We all have to take responsibility for our lapses by saying, I guess I didn't really pay enough attention. So again, attention is kind of a way of talking, but it's also a real thing. Now, attention is a limited resource in the prefrontal cortex. You can only pay attention to one thing at a time. People who tell you they are multitasking are in fact rapidly switching. You
Yeah,
cannot divide attention. You don't have enough of it. You have one precious channel of attention, and it can only do one thing at a time. And so building up attention is one of the main things children do in development. Their attention improves, expands, and they get better at controlling it. So there's two pieces to attention. There's the resource itself, how much attention is available, and how well you can control it. Now,
yeah,
if you have two languages that are active in your mind and bashing up against each other, you are constantly required to control your attention. There's no switch. So from a very early age, and I will argue from infancy,
yeah,
being in a bilingual environment means practicing the resource. This is the aerobic fitness training that will then serve whatever else you want to do. You build up the aerobic fitness, you can do lots of things with that. So building up attentional control from an early age makes it more available. Now, I said there's two pieces to attention, the sort of size of the resource and the control. We have no evidence that bilingualism gives you more attention. It's a very limited resource. But I think we do have evidence that bilinguals have better attentional control and it is more efficient. So if a resource is efficient, what does it mean if your car has fuel efficiency? It's easy. It means you go farther on a tank of gas. That's
exactly.
what efficiency means.
Yeah,
So what I'm saying is that bilingualism builds up attentional efficiency. So because bilinguals are always having to control attention, they're more efficient and their attention is more available. So now when you give a bilingual a problem that requires a bunch of attention, they can say, yeah, that's no problem. I can do that. Where it might be just beyond the reach of a monolingual. So to see these effects, you have to take monolinguals and bilinguals and give them a task that just gradually increases how much attention is required. And if this story is right, then if the task is easy, not much attention is required, both groups will do the same.
exactly.
But if you make it harder and harder and harder, you're going to need more fuel efficiency to go further. So we've shown this behaviorally. We've shown it with EEG, electrophysiology. Bilinguals have more efficient control of attention so that as a problem gets more difficult, they can still hold on.
Yeah. And that explains why they can get very good results doing executive function tests as well. Some, because
Some,
attention is underlying there. Yes.
exactly, but only some.
Yeah.
So if the executive function test has these features, needs a lot of attention, whatever, you're going to get results.
Interesting. And you mentioned that since the 80s, we've known that both languages are active in the brain, and now you mentioned EEG. So how has neuroimaging helped understand the connection between language and cognition, more specifically bilingualism and cognition?
There's wonderful research with neuroimaging. There's both structural imaging that shows, visible and significant differences in the brains. And there's functional imaging that shows that connections between brain regions are used differently in solving problems. And both of them point to important differences between monolingual and bilingual brains. They're both true. So the kinds of network connectivity that you see in monolinguals and bilinguals is different. In short, I'm going to say, just to summarize a whole bunch of research, when you're not doing anything, when you're staring into space, and your mind is kind of blank.
Wondering, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. It's just relaxing. Your brain is still active. And what it's showing is what's called resting state connectivity. So what is connected to what when you're not thinking about anything, okay? And now there's a whole bunch of studies that show that the resting state of a bilingual brain is more prepared for problem solving than is the resting state of a monolingual brain. This is fascinating research. There's a bunch of studies that show it. It's still early days. At the same time, there are structures. For example, white matter tracts. White matter is measured by the myelin covering certain important brain tracts that enhances connectivity and transmission of signals. And again, there's a bunch of studies that show better white matter structure in bilingual brains than monolingual brains. These are real differences, real brain differences in structure and function. So the neuroimaging piece has been a total game changer in opening up incredible avenues into how the brains and therefore the minds are different as a function of bilingual experience.
Yeah, that's incredible. I remember reading, I think it was Adna Andrews at Duke University, who did study using neuroimaging. Also, Yubin Abutalebi, I think, who wrote something, but that was an older paper. But again, showing that like the both, let's call them substrates, or for L1, L2, or language one and additional language, they're pretty much the same. But as long as you are proficient, the more proficient you get, because there's very different activation apparently when you are learning a new language, right? But as long as you get more and more proficient, then it's quite similar. Yeah, that's very interesting. Does that connect now? Because the other paper, you talk about cognitive reserve. So there are evident structural and functional changes in the brain. Does that have a connection to cognitive reserve, and why bilingual brains usually display symptoms of dementia later when compared to monolingual brains?
Right. Yes.
Yes, that's it. That's the great, wonderful. And the question I have here. So I remember again a couple of years ago, people talking about how you can get 5 to even 7 years of a, let's say, more functional, healthier brain life. Is that aligned with the research, Ellen? You
Yes. Yes, it is. So here's what's going on with that.
Yeah.
So people get into a real lather about whether or not young adult bilinguals perform a Stroop task better than monolinguals, to
Yeah.
which I say, who cares? I mean,
Yeah.
really, if this is sort of these are interesting results, it's interesting research, but who cares? The real care is the research showing postponed onset of dementia symptoms and maintained cognitive function in light of declining brain structure in older age. Now, there's something you can care about, right? So,
Definitely.
what's that all about? So, what we and others have shown is, as you say, these are real findings, postponement of dementia systems, and so on. Now, when dementia symptoms occur in a bilingual patient and they're whatever many years older than a monolingual patient, their brain has deteriorated far more. They have worse
Yeah.
brains. That trips up a lot of people. They say, what do you mean? How could a bilingual have a worse brain? Because the brain has been suffering from the neuropathology, but the cognitive ability have not fallen with it.
Yeah.
And so there's the appearance of normal functioning, even though it's not at all normal functioning. Now, I have been told, and I've been told this when I've spoken to medical audiences, well, that's no good at all because you're postponing treatment. And I say, treatment for dementia, what you got? What you got?
Right.
They
Yeah.
got nothing, right?
Yeah.
So what they are doing is somehow using their more efficient brains
Yeah.
to compensate for the buildup of neuropathology and function at a normal level for longer. Now, when the neuropathology catches up and they can no longer function, they totally crash and burn. The
Yeah.
decline is more rapid, but they've just had 4 more years, which pretty good, right?
Yeah. Definitely.
So that's what's happening. In my opinion, I think that these results with older patients and dementia is this more efficient mind and brain holding on as long as possible, even under conditions of neuropathology, and then providing a little bit extra time of function.
Wonderful. So it's fair to say that there are cognitive advantages related to bilingualism, right? So, but I think the big question here is, when do I have to start the bilingual experience? Because you have early bilinguals, kids who have been exposed to an additional language, and now you may have adults learning another language. Well, I am a bilingual. I started learning English when I was a kid, but now I am actually learning Mandarin because I'm going to China for 2 months. And it's never been, so hard. Actually, learning a language has never been so
Yeah.
hard. But does that still help me? I'm a 39-year-old man. Is it, that does that make sense?
Right. So here's the thing. So
Yeah,
first of all, um, this stuff about at what age can you learn another language? You
yeah.
can learn another language at any age. There
Yes, thank you
is,
for
I'm going
saying
to
that.
say
Yes.
this as dogmatically as possible. There
Yeah,
is no biological critical period for the acquisition of a second language.
yeah.
There is an age-related effect.
Mhm.
It's harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. Older is always harder, but there's no critical period.
Yeah. So the
So
window never closes, right?
it
Yeah,
never went, not for a second language.
yeah,
Critical period for a first language, absolutely.
yeah.
But once you have language, learning another language is more of a cognitive problem rather than configuring the resources in the language regions of your brain so that you can acquire language. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So there isn't an age by which you have to acquire a second language, but older and older is harder and harder. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
However, as you age, what's good for your brain is what's hard for your brain
Yeah.
because your brain thrives by the exercise of dealing with complexity and stimulation. Learning a language, especially a hard language like Mandarin,
Yes. Yeah.
is it's brain exercise. It's a fantastic thing to keep your brain fit, but it's not going to make you bilingual in Mandarin. I mean, two
Yes.
months you'll get better, you'll be able to manage, but you're not going to walk away as a perfect trilingual, right? You're not,
Yes.
that's not going to happen, but it's still good for your brain. And everything that's good for your brain gives, on average, more life to your brain, more cognitive, extension into older age. So older adults should always take the opportunity to learn another language, not because it's going to make them bilingual, but because it's a wonderful, stimulating thing to do with your mind.
And we're moving toward the end of this amazing chat. A lot of adult learners, they complain that they don't have time, or it's too expensive, or whatever. They have other priorities. But I think it was you who wrote a paper that even a couple of weeks using an app can have an impact on cognition as well, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm
Yeah,
using,
that was a cool
yeah,
study. The
yeah,
whole thing was the idea of my colleague Jed Meltzer,
yeah,
and he set up the whole thing, and I got to go along for the ride. But I love this study.
yeah.
So we had three groups. We had monolingual older adults. They were over 65. I don't remember much more about them, but they were all monolingual. And we gave them a whole pile of tests, like cognitive tests and executive function, all kinds of stuff. And then we divided them into three groups. And one group was given this brain training thing. You see these advertised,
Oh, yes.
brain exercise and make
Yeah.
yourself smarter. So these brain training exercises, interestingly, are not all that different from executive function tasks. Like they're
Uh-huh.
timed and they have
Yeah.
conflict, and it's kind of like, endless cycle of doing things like the Simon task and Stroop task, something like that.
Yeah.
So they did that for 16 weeks, a certain number of hours, like 30 minutes a day, whatever, I don't remember. And then they were retested. A second group had Duolingo Spanish
Yeah.
on their phones, and they had to do that for 16 weeks. And the third group just kindly went away and then came back to be retested. They didn't do
Yeah.
anything. And the improvement on the second test, now remember, the tests are very much like the tests that these brain game
Yeah.
training people were doing. The Duolingo people who were learning Spanish improved almost as much
Wow.
just by doing Spanish.
Yeah.
And
And
it's
and the
because
other
they
group
were,
was actually training. They were practicing the test, for the test that they would take
right,
again, right? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the Spanish people were just learning Spanish.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because the one thing that the Duolingo people did not improve on that the brain group did is speed. But
Ah,
all of the brain tasks are speeded. So they were becoming really fast with this little thing.
yeah.
So we were thinking, well, maybe if Duolingo had a speeded kind of component, we could make it more equal. But anyway, it was still pretty impressive that on all the measures, the Duolingo people improved almost as much as the brain game people.
Yeah, that's amazing, just by studying a language. So I do have two more questions for you, Ellen, and one concerns this concept of translanguaging and pedagogy. I mean, It has to do with teaching, really, because
Yeah.
nowadays people are looking for the best teaching methodologies, and especially those who are buying this whole bilingual curriculum idea. They want to bring that to their schools. Can the research that you do inform teachers in that sense? What should work best if you're trying to help your students learn more effectively? Is it okay for you to translanguage? Can you use all languages you know? Should you focus on just the target language that they're studying, or is there anything else?
So I have to say that this is beyond my expertise, and I'm aware of the translanguaging literature. I have not followed the research very closely, and I don't think that it would be responsible for me to comment. I think
Yeah,
pedagogical research is absolutely important. I haven't done any, um, but I wouldn't want to
yeah.
weigh in on this particular issue.
Perfect. And the last question I have for you concerns, as a 39-year-old man who's studying Chinese now, and I started just a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to China in about 6 weeks. Uh, what are some tips or ideas that you can share with us, people who are learning a new language at an older age? There are older adults that come from your research that might inspire people to carry on, because I think people give up very quickly. It's hard. Learning a
Oh,
new language is
yeah.
very hard. So what can you tell us? What are the
Well,
tips you
so
can
well,
share?
we look
Yeah.
at different aspects of bilingualism. We look at what their proficiency is, how perfectly they can conjugate verbs, how much they use it, in what context, and so on and so on. And I think the most important thing, way more important than how well you can conjugate the verbs, the most important thing is using the language as much as possible in a range of dynamic contexts. So the more context, the better. And even though what you're saying will be grammatically imperfect, it's the use of language that is driving the effects, not the proficiency. We do have studies that compare, use versus proficiency. It's always use. It's the
Yeah.
use that exercises your brain, not the proficiency. So I would say dive in. I'll just end with a little anecdote. My daughter, um, who's now older than you, but when
Yeah.
she was a kid, she's an outstanding language learner. She speaks many languages extremely well. When she was in high school, she won the German prize and got a trip to Germany for the
Oh,
summer. So her
wow.
German is really good. And we were once in a context where the family, we were out for tea in a cafe, and there were all kinds of problems. And they brought the wrong order, and the waiter did. And we were told that the manager only spoke German. Um, and so we said, well, no problem. My daughter speaks German. Bring the
Okay.
manager. So I can understand most of German. I can't speak it, but I can follow what's being said. So she explains what's going on. But she stops short of some of the worst problems, like when the waiter dropped the entire teapot and it crashed
Hmm.
down and stuff. So I said, well, why didn't you tell him about that? And she said, because I don't use verbs I can't fully conjugate.
Oh, okay. She was being a perfectionist then.
So
Yes.
my advice to you is don't be that.
Yes, that's great advice, And it's such a pity that people are relying on artificial intelligence nowadays, right? Because so you
Yeah,
can use ChatGPT or Google Translate instead of actually learning or trying to learn a new language, because it's easier. But that's definitely not going to make your brain a little bit more powerful, right?
it's not. That's for
Yes.
sure.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ellen Bialystok, and thank you everyone for watching. Stay tuned for more episodes. The Learning Cosmos podcast is coming out every month. And Dr. Ellen Bialystok, again, it was a pleasure, an honor. Thank you for
It was
accepting.
fun. Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.